Hello and welcome to Inspiral Out Loud, where Mars and I are chatting about energy today. What's your take on nuclear energy?
Nuclear energy is a complete and colossal waste of time and resources, in my opinion. The reason for it is the promise of nuclear energy, what it was that it was cheap and clean, and of course that's proven to be completely and patently false. Let's start off with the cost-benefit analysis of using nuclear energy. In itself, once these things are established, theoretically, you'll get a great cost-benefit going on. The problem is if you account all of the energy that's used, and once again, it's going back to oil consumption and coal power or what other powers that are being used to do the mining, the processing, the building of these enormous structures, dealing with nuclear waste, disposal of nuclear waste, which is a massive, massive problem. When you, just from the fossil fuel consumption, if you took all of the fuel, the coal, the oil, etc., that was used to produce enough materials to produce the nuclear reactors, the disposal of the nuclear material, the processing of the nuclear material, the mining of the nuclear material, you would find you would only get about a 20% improvement. In other words, you would only gain about 20% of the energy out of the nuclear fuel used to produce electricity than if you'd simply taken all of that oil and coal and burnt it to produce the other 80%. In other words, the cost involved with doing it, of course, it makes companies that run these mines, the facilities themselves, etc. It's a great profit for those companies, but the price that you pay for that is all of the waste, not just the nuclear waste, but all the other byproduct waste that's produced, because you've got to use a lot of chemistry, you've got to use a lot of chemicals, using tons and tons and tons of concrete, and the list goes on of the environmental problems associated with nuclear power. You've got the disaster, the Chernobyl disaster, you've got the Fukushima disaster, which is still going on. That is one of the most devastating nuclear events, and it's just one of potentials on the long list of nuclear facilities around the world. It's a colossal waste of our time. All of that time and energy should have been spent on actually getting into the real technologies which would truly change the world for the better. And that is, of course, the ridiculed and scoffed at idea of free energy, which if people really spent any time looking into would realize, and that includes the scientific community, and some of them have actually figured it out on their own, that there is a enormous amount of background energy certainly throughout the world, perhaps throughout the entire universe. Many physicists in the past have talked about it under various names. Einstein called it ether space. Many other physicists have talked about it, particularly the physicists whose name has been practically written out of history, like Nikola Tesla, and many others, Morley. There's a list of maybe nearly 20 physicists that have stumbled across this same idea and have done experiments to sometimes to conclusively prove that there is an enormous amount of background energy. They're talking about even quantum physics. They're talking about something like within a cubic centimeter of empty space, there is enough energy to run a submarine to go around the world 3 times. That's the kind of energy we're talking about. The trouble is,
I heard Stephen Greer
saying
that a centimeter of space could power New York for 3 days or something wild.
And in more recent times, there have been a couple of, some of them qualified physicists, but also a lot of people have figured this out independently and sometimes accidentally, that you can tap into that energy and very cheaply using devices that would last a lifetime, that don't require much in terms of materials, and at very little low production cost. There's a man by the name of John Searle who spent the last 30 to 40 years working on how to get this technology out to the public. He actually developed this technology, I think it was in the late 70s, using magnets in a special configuration that can tap into that background energy. These machines he's been talking about more recently, he's teamed up with a qualified nuclear physicist who was very skeptical about John Searle for a number of years, and but he sort of, I think he sort of bit the bullet and decided he just wanted, there was something in him that said, yeah, maybe there's some truth to this idea. And after 2 years with John Searle, he realized that it is feasible, that because John Searle was able to explain to him exactly how this technology works. It wasn't just, oh, I found this device and look, it does this weird thing. It was actually, he could explain how it functions. So they've been collaborating, trying to work out how to get these devices onto the market. And of course, that's leading them into all sorts of headaches because of national interests and supposed national security interests, economic concerns, because the economy largely is driven by the cost of oil. I mean, that's what the US dollar is essentially based on, is the price of oil. And what would that do to the market? I mean, it would decimate it essentially. Now, these devices he was talking about, if you think about most of our energy production, it's actually in cars. Cars use a crap load of energy compared to what we use in a household. And even one of these small devices that would be approximately 1.5 by 1.5 and maybe 20 centimeters tall, something you could easily put in your boot, would cost about $12,000 US, but would last a lifetime. Compare that to the cost of how much your petrol costs and how much you would spend over a year. It will pay for itself within 2 or 3 years for most people. And you would, if you had an electric car, that would never expire.
Amazing.
So, yeah. And, this is just one of dozens of technologies that are accessing the same energy. It's just a question of how do you get this to the public, bypassing the movers and shakers who really don't want this technology out there.
Yeah. And there are some people that are on that route of starting to get that technology out. Like there's Susan Manowich from the New Energy Movement in America, and she did a interesting talk with, again, Joe Montano from Collective Evolution. And yeah, their entire business is based around receiving ideas from inventors around different technologies and seeing if they are viable, if they actually do what they say they're going to do. She said about 1 in 100 proposals actually makes its way through their organization. And so that's the New Energy Movement. So that's interesting to look at. But you mentioned somebody else, John Hutchinson, regarding radio transmissions.
Yeah, John Hutchinson has been experimenting, following on from one of the more well-known physicists in history, who was playing around with combining different electromagnetic radiation types. Everything from ultra low frequencies to microwaves, radio, and through trial and error and experimentation has discovered some truly bizarre effects. He's got a website where he's shown a number of videos and which people seem to think have been debunked, but he's actually had independent crews come in with cameras and showing what's going on. And as far as I can tell, it's absolutely real. One video actually shows a block of iron sitting on a wooden table. Now, before I even tell you what happened to this piece of iron, let's talk about what would happen if you tried to melt or bend that piece of iron. It's about 1.5 inches diameter, and it was probably about 12 inches tall. How much energy it would take to either bend it or melt it? We're talking about a hell of a lot of energy. And if it was heated up, it certainly would set the table on fire, because steel melts at, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's something around, well, it's certainly higher than the temperature that kerosene burns at, which is well in excess of, I think, 1,200 degrees. Wood is not going to survive it. And yet we're seeing a video of a block of iron, bending over on a wooden table. It's literally bending over like it was melting. And yet immediately after, he came and picked it up off the table with his bare hand, and it was cold.
Yeah,
and he was doing that.
Bizarre.
Yeah. And of course, that iron becomes incredibly brittle. You can almost snap it in half with your bare hands after that's happened to it.
Yeah.
What's going on there? I mean, it's such a bizarre thing, and I'm really stunned that it's not mainstream knowledge, especially in the scientific community. They should be absolutely boggled by this. It's such a simple thing, but just the fact that frequencies can cause metal to do that is so bizarre in conventional thinking. It should be across the news, and it's not. And he's been doing this for over a decade.
Yeah.
What he has had is many visits from the FBI, because they're very concerned with what he's doing with that.
I'm sure they are.
But the point of showing things like that is to illustrate the lack of knowledge in mainstream scientific communities, and that they really haven't thought beyond what has been largely taught in universities, which of course goes back to control of information and knowledge.
I was going to say, they're not allowed to think beyond that, are they?
Well, in my opinion, no, they're not. And I don't think even the professors that teach physics are even aware of that situation. I think they're largely oblivious to that their own institutions are essentially controlled externally through various mechanisms that they're not entirely aware even occur. I mean, I don't think, why would you even assume in that world where they spend so much of their life studying and at considerable personal expense financially to achieve degrees and PhDs and master's degrees. I think it would be an enormous challenge to their worldview if that was suddenly challenged with, guess what, guys? There's a whole realm of physics that you're not aware even exist, and no one's telling you. I think that would be very difficult to swallow.
Absolutely.